I have a confession to make. A confession. I'm really bad at Christmas. I have no natural desire to decorate or give gifts or do anything festive at all. But Pauline and I figured it'd be good to give our kids some sense of culture. So nowadays we try to give some kind of tradition. So we got ourselves an Advent wreath, and every week we light a different candle and we sing about the Christmas story. And the kids are really into it, but I highly suspect it's just because they like fire. They've always been excited about that. We also got ourselves an Advent calendar, and usually I love Advent calendars because there's chocolate. What's not to like about chocolate? Except this one doesn't have any chocolate in it. This one is like this reusable calendar that has magnets in it. And so every week we open up a wooden compartment and we take out this little figurine and we stick it into the nativity set, and that's our activity. And it actually looks kind of cute, gotta say. And the kids were really into it for a week or so, and then they just completely lost interest. So that's our set over there. And it's not that bad, but they lost interest, and so I've just been stuffing it full of chocolate every day, and now they're really into it. So I think they're just in it for the chocolate. I highly suspect they're just a bunch of pagans in my house. I also put up a Christmas tree this year, and then Pauline saw it. And I bet you've never seen anybody angry at a Christmas tree before, but now I can say I've seen someone angry at a Christmas tree before. And so she had to redo our whole Christmas tree, and the kids and I were just watching her awkwardly. I was trying not to laugh. But now it looks good. That's our Christmas tree. It actually looks pretty decent. The challenge now is to make this good next year. And so I have a plan, I have a hack, where I found on the internet that there's some people who wrap up their entire Christmas tree, decorations and all, and they stick it in the storage, and then a year later they just bring it out, just unwrap it, and there it goes. Perfect, right? Don't have to decorate again if anything goes wrong and blame it on Pauline. This is great. So I imagine all of us have some kind of a Christmas tradition, and for a lot of us, there's a lot to do in the holidays. There's people to see, presents to buy, things to wear. And it's easy to get lost in the details and forget what Christmas is all about. I actually think it's quite unnatural to appreciate the full meaning of Christmas. Even if you go to church, there's certain standard stories that you always hear about the shepherds and the angels and the wise men and the baby in the manger. That's good. That's good stuff. It's in the Bible. Don't want to downplay any of that stuff. But there are these fringe stories that never get talked about. And I think if you want to feel the power of Christmas, you actually have to go into the darker and scarier and sadder parts of the Christmas story, because they will actually speak into the darker moments of our own lives. So my question today is, what is the full meaning of Christmas? I want to show you today that Christmas is God's answer to evil. Once again, Christmas is God's answer to evil. And if we want to feel the power of the Christmas story, we need to remember what is evil, and we need to remember the Savior. And we'll see this in our Bible passage. Our Bible passage comes from the book of Revelation. It's one of those weird Bible passages where you read it and you're like, what the heck did I just read? Because it features a strange-looking woman and a strange-looking dragon and a whole bunch of symbols that don't make sense at first. But I think once we unpack these symbols, you'll see why the Christmas story in this chapter is so powerful. So I'll read it to you now from the book of Revelation, chapter 12, verses 1 to 5. It says, "A great sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun and with the moon under her feet and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its heads. Its tail swept a third of the star out of the sky and flung them to earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. Told you it was weird. But based on this passage, my first point is that we need to remember what is evil. One of my favorite Christmas stories comes from about 100 years ago. True story. The year was 1914. World War I had just started about 5 months back, and it was a brutal war. Soldiers on both sides were just terribly exhausted. And on the front lines, the soldiers lived in trenches, these artificial ditches that they had built for themselves to protect themselves from the gunfire. And they did a pretty good job protecting themselves from gunfire, but these trenches didn't protect them from other things. So these trenches were really cold. They filled up with water. There were rats. There was disease. It was just a miserable place to be. And these soldiers would spend weeks on end in these trenches. But Christmas Day that year felt a little bit different. The Germans put some candles on top of their trenches. Some were brave enough to even put the candles on trees, even though they exposed themselves a little. And they started singing Christmas carols, and not to be outdone, the British heard them sing the Christmas carols, and they sang Christmas carols too. And the two sides started to shout Christmas greetings to each other. The one soldier was brave or reckless enough to poke his head out of the trench, and he didn't get shot. Then someone walked unarmed into no man's land, this deadly space between the trenches where people normally died, and he didn't get shot. And so soon there were soldiers from both sides that coming out of the trenches, and they shook hands with their enemies. They took pictures with each other, and they played soccer, and they exchanged gifts. And for that one day, they felt like human beings again. As it turns out, those soldiers had no desire to kill or to be killed. They were just ordinary human beings who were there because some higher power had forced them to be there. They were there because there was evil in the world. And maybe all of us can relate to those soldiers on some level because we've all felt the power of evil in our own lives. We've all experienced broken systems, pressure from our environment to do what's wrong. And sometimes the world feels dark, maybe even malicious. So our Bible passage gives us a picture of this evil that we feel, that we all feel. And to appreciate this picture, we need to just try to imagine this scene that's depicted in our Bible passage so we can appreciate it from a gut level. So we picture a woman giving birth. She's in tremendous pain. This was before modern medicine. Childbirth was always extremely painful and extremely dangerous. But this birth story was far worse than normal because this woman was being stalked by a dragon. Is an enormous, evil, terrifying dragon who was ready to devour the child the moment he was born. And according to our Bible passage, that's what the first Christmas was like. And if you understood your Old Testament like you're a Jewish person, you would appreciate the symbols because they're so rich with meaning. The woman clothed with the sun stands for the community of faith. We know that because towards the beginning of the Bible, there's this guy named Joseph, and he has this dream with the sun, moon, and the stars. And these sun, moon, and stars represent his family, the family of his father Israel, the community of faith. And this story reminds us that right before Jesus was born, the community of faith was really suffering. They were suffering from persecution, disease, captivity, injustice, but they were waiting for a child because God had promised them a child who would be their Savior. But God's people were not the only ones who were waiting for this child. Their enemy was waiting too. And in our Bible passage, there's an enormous red dragon. And later on in the chapter, we find out this dragon is Satan. This enormous size of this dragon reminds us of his strength. The color of this dragon is red because this dragon had killed so many of God's people. The dragon had 10 horns, which were a symbol of strength. And it seemed like this dragon was invincible. It had 7 heads and 7 crowns to remind us that Satan has political power to influence governments. And sometimes it feels like Satan is completely in control. Now, all these symbols are symbolic. All these pictures are symbolic. Real life doesn't quite look like that. When Jesus was born, his mother wasn't like clothed in the sun or something like that. She was an ordinary human being. And it wasn't a dragon that tried to kill her, but it was King Herod, a jealous king. But our passage tells us what was going on behind the scenes. That it was Satan who had influenced Herod to do this, to make this terrible order to kill all the babies in Bethlehem. And so there was a much deeper reason why Jesus' family had to suffer through so much evil, and we still experience this reason even nowadays. As it turns out, we're at war. And the rest of the chapter makes it clear we are at war. And it's not because we've sought out this war, but it's because Satan has decided to come after us. And the world is broken because this whole world has become a battlefield. And we all feel this brokenness on some level. We all have our own scars from our encounters with evil and injustice and corruption. So the Bible uses the story to prepare us for the difficulties of life. It tells us not to expect things to be easy or comfortable or pleasant, because it's time to be a soldier, to make a difference. It's time to pitch in and use your talents for the work of eternity, because people's lives and eternities are at stake. And you'll be shocked how much one person can do if they take God's mission seriously. And so, let's not dream of having a comfortable life. We'll get that later on. We'll have all of eternity to enjoy life as it's meant to be. But right now, it's time to make a difference. Right now, we have to fight against Satan. That said, we are no match for Satan on our own, which leads me to our second point. The second point is that we need to remember the Savior. Jocko Willink was a Navy SEAL and a commander of a military operation. He was deployed in Iraq in 2006, and he was stationed in the city of Ramadi, which was right in the heart of the enemy activity. And inevitably, there was shooting, and one day there was a terrible firefight that broke out. There was blood and screaming and death. And at the end of that firefight, both sides realized something that was just truly awful, that they had not been shooting at the enemy, but they had been shooting against friendly soldiers in their confusion. And everyone from that incident was badly shaken. A lot of people were wounded. One person was killed, and this whole incident was reported up the chain of command. And Jocko's commanding officer told him to stop all operations. The commanding officer was flying in, investigating officer was coming in, and they wanted Jocko to prepare a debrief, to tell him exactly what had happened and who was responsible. And Jocko knew exactly what this meant. It meant that someone had to pay. Someone had to get fired for this. So Jocko went through the details, and there was plenty of guilt, plenty of blame to go around. But as he went through the details over and over again, just something didn't feel right. He couldn't put a finger on it. Who was to blame? Until right before the debrief, he figured it out. There was one person to blame. He walked into that debrief meeting. Other soldiers from the firefight were there. One of them was all bandaged up in his face, in his hand. The commanding officer, the investigating officer were there. Jocko stood up and asked them one simple question: whose fault is this? When the soldiers put up his hand and said, "It's my fault. I let my soldiers under my command wander out of their zone, and that was the start of all this trouble." And Jocko said, "No, it's not your fault." Another soldier raised up his hand and said, "No, it's my fault. I didn't communicate my position fast enough. And as a result, there was confusion. As a result, people were killed." Jocko said, "No, it's not your fault." The third soldier spoke up, said, "Boss, it's my fault. I was the one who shot and killed a friendly soldier." Jocko said, "No, it's not your fault. It's not the fault of any of you. There's one person at fault. There's one person to blame, and that is me. I'm the senior man in this operation. I am responsible for everything that happens in the operation." And Jocko went on to explain all the things that they had to do differently in the future, the new policies and strategies to prevent this kind of thing from happening again. And the other soldiers really appreciated that, the ones who were under him, because they knew that he was not denying responsibility. He was not passing the blame down to them, but he was taking it upon himself to make things right. And whatever you might think about the war in Iraq, I think this particular example was an example of good leadership. And that's what we see, actually, in our Bible passage. We've all seen bad leadership where people are incompetent or selfish or corrupt, and they take the glory and they blame others. But good leadership empowers the people who are being led, and good leadership is a blessing. And with that background in mind, let's go back to our Bible passage. John says of the pregnant woman, "She gave birth to a son, a male child who will rule the nations with an iron scepter. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne." And so this verse is clear. This child, Jesus, was meant to rule the nations, and he rules from the throne room of God. So Jesus is a king. And to a lot of people, that's not very exciting at all, because we have no shortage of people who want to tell us what to do. No shortage of people who want power over us. And there's so many people who have had nothing but bad leadership in their life, and they just assume that Jesus is just another leader like that. But our verse gives us reason to believe otherwise. One reason is actually in the quotation. You'll see these quotation marks where it says he'll rule all the nations with an iron scepter. And there's quotation marks there because it's quoting an earlier part of the Bible in Psalm chapter 2, where God gives us a promise. God gives his people a promise that there will come a Savior, a king who will rule the nations. The Savior who would come from God. And if this Savior came from God, we should expect him to be good, because we have a good God who only gives good gifts. And as we study this verse really deeply, we find a second reason to believe that this king would be different. In our English Bibles, it says that he will rule the nations. But in the original language, it says he will shepherd the nations. The same word can be translated rule or shepherd, and typically it's translated shepherd. Shepherd the nations. Last Friday, Pastor Tim talked about what it means to be a shepherd. A shepherd is actually the greatest thing that a flock of sheep could have. Because a shepherd helps them to have a kind of quality of life they would never have otherwise. The sheep can live in safety because the shepherd is protecting them from wild animals. The sheep have things to eat because the shepherd is leading them where the food is. The sheep can live a better life because the shepherd is taking care of them when they're sick or when they're injured. They stay together because the shepherd is herding them back in. Shepherd is an amazing thing for sheep. And Jesus says the highest standards of shepherd is that the shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And later on, after our main passage, we see exactly that, a shepherd that lays down his life for the sheep. And that's good leadership. He does tell us what to do, but we can trust him because he knows better than us. He's determined to bring out the best in us. Because he loves us, he would go through anything for us. And he's taken responsibility for our lives. I actually find a lot of practical value in thinking of Jesus as my shepherd. It actually gives me a lot of comfort and security. This past week was one of those super busy weeks. I looked at my schedule and I thought, I have no idea how I'm going to get everything done. And I think a normal person in my circumstances would find it extremely stressful, actually. But the whole time I was just remembering, Jesus is my leader. He has responsibility for my life. Everything that happens is up to him. His responsibility is to make sure that I have what I need, and my part is just to follow him. Just follow the way of love and do my best. It's his job to make things turn out properly. And so I have nothing to worry about because he does his job. And in the long run, I'll depend on this leader, this shepherd, to make the world right again, to defeat the brokenness of the world and put an end to the source of evil, which is Satan himself. And that's what I've learned from the Christmas story. God gave us the gift of the shepherd king.